The heavy, humid air of the Miami gym clung to the skin like a second layer of clothing, thick with the salt of the nearby Atlantic and the sour, lingering scent of decades of effort. Dust motes danced in the slanted shafts of afternoon light that pierced through the high, grime-streaked windows, illuminating a space where time seemed to have slowed to a deliberate crawl. Muhammad Ali occupied the center of this world with a serene, almost terrifying grace, his presence commanding the room without the need for a single word. He moved with a precision that bordered on the mathematical, each shadow-boxed punch and every subtle shift of his weight appearing effortless, as if he were tuned into a frequency no one else could hear. His expression remained a mask of absolute calm, a testament to a mind that had already mastered the chaos of combat long before the first bell rang. The rhythmic symphony of the gym began to falter the moment the heavy entrance door creaked open, admitting a figure that disrupted the atmosphere like a physical blow. Jack Holt did not merely enter the room. He laid claim to it with the heavy, rhythmic stride of a conqueror. He was a massive slab of a man, his frame built from layers of dense muscle and scarred skin that spoke of countless nights spent in the violent periphery of the sport. His face was a map of jagged lines and a perpetually set jaw, radiating the raw, unpolished aggression of a man who viewed the world as something to be broken and reshaped by his hands. As he moved deeper into the facility, the sharp snap of jump ropes died away, and the rhythmic thud of gloves against heavy bags faded into an uneasy silence. The younger fighters stepped back toward the brick walls, instinctively sensing the collision of two irreconcilable forces. The air grew taut, vibrating with the friction between Ali's cold, elevated mastery and the primitive, smoldering heat of Holt's resentment, until the only sound remaining was the distant, muffled hum of the city outside. Holt leaned against the edge of the ring, his massive forearms resting heavily on the top rope, his posture an intentional display of mockery directed at the man in the center. He watched the champion move with a disdain that ran bone-deep, a fundamental rejection of the artistry and the rhythm that the world celebrated as genius. To Holt, the fluid footwork and the hypnotic weaving were nothing more than a sophisticated lie, a set of expensive curtains drawn over the ugly, brutal reality of what it meant for two men to hurt one another. He believed in the crushing weight of a fist, the dull thud of a body hitting the floor, and the jagged truth found only in the moments when breathing became a struggle through broken ribs. His internal world was a landscape of iron and stone, forged in alleyways and back rooms where there were no referees to stop the bleeding and no bells to signal a reprieve. He looked at Ali and saw a performer, a man of words and mirrors who had never truly felt the suffocating pressure of an opponent who did not care for the sport, only for the destruction. Every elegant movement the champion made acted as a fresh insult to Holt's philosophy of violence, fueling a smoldering fire of resentment that demanded a physical outlet to prove that the myth of the greatest could be dismantled by a sufficiently heavy hand. The champion did not offer the reaction that Holt so desperately sought to provoke, remaining instead within a sphere of impenetrable detachment. Ali met the intruder's hard, predatory gaze with a look that contained neither the heat of anger nor the tremor of hesitation. It was a terrifyingly neutral expression, the kind of stillness found at the center of a hurricane, where the air was eerily quiet despite the devastation swirling just outside. This lack of visible emotion acted on Holt like an abrasive, grating against his nerves more effectively than any insult could have. He wanted to see a flicker of doubt, a tensing of the jaw, or a defensive sharpening of the eyes, but he found only a vast, cool ocean of confidence. To Holt, this silence was the ultimate arrogance, a refusal to even acknowledge the threat that he embodied. The more Ali remained a statue of composure, the more Holt felt his own control slipping, replaced by a desperate, primal urge to shatter that peace. He saw the champion's tranquility as a fragile mask that would surely crumble under the first genuine impact of a man who lived within the darkness of the struggle, and he became obsessed with being the one to tear it away. The tension in the gym reached a point of absolute saturation, the air vibrating with the unspoken promise of a collision that transcended mere sparring. Holt pushed himself off the ropes, his movements jagged and heavy, his eyes locked onto the man who refused to flinch. He began to strip away his shirt, the fabric tearing slightly under the strain of his massive shoulders, revealing a torso that served as a grim testament to a life of conflict. His skin was a canvas of raised white lines and discolored patches where bone had met flesh too many times to count. Each scar a memory of a fight that had nothing to do with trophies or glory. He stepped over the ropes and onto the canvas with a weight that seemed to make the very boards groan under his feet, his presence filling the ring with an aura of suffocating hostility. Across from him, Ali remained perfectly poised, his body loose and his breathing rhythmic, watching the giant approach with the detached interest of a scientist observing a predictable reaction. With a single fluid motion, the champion let his towel slide from his shoulders to the floor, standing in the center of the ring in his white trunks. He did not tighten his muscles or adopt a traditional guard. He simply existed in a state of deceptive, effortless lightness, a stark and jarring contrast to the grounded, trembling fury of the man who had come to break him. The two stood mere feet apart, the scarred veteran and the untouchable king, as the world outside the ring ceased to exist, leaving only the imminent, inevitable crash of their two worlds. The confrontation began not with a sound, but with a sudden, violent displacement of air as Holt lunged forward, his entire massive frame committed to a single, devastating hook. He was a force of nature, a physical manifestation of a coastal storm that sought to level everything in its path through sheer, unadulterated mass. Yet, as his fist reached the space where the champion's jaw had been a microsecond before, it encountered nothing but the fading heat of a ghost. Ali moved with a fluidity that defied the frantic eyes of the observers, his feet barely skimming the canvas as he glided backward and slightly to the left, a movement so economical it looked like a trick of the light. Holt reset and swung again, a straight right delivered with enough torque to crack a concrete pillar, but the result was identical. The champion's head slipped the punch by a distance no wider than a coin, his eyes wide and focused, absorbing every detail of Holt's mechanics. To Holt, the experience was beginning to feel hallucinatory. He was accustomed to the solid resistance of bone and the satisfying resistance of meat. But here his knuckles only cut through the humid gymnasium air, leaving him stumbling under the weight of his own momentum. Every subsequent attack from Holt became a study in the kinetics of frustration. He launched a barrage of blows, each one intended to end the encounter. Yet each one served only to further exhaust his own reserves. He was fighting a man who seemed to exist in a different dimension of time, someone who saw the punch coming long before the shoulder even began to rotate. Ali did not throw a single strike in return, choosing instead to dismantle Holt's spirit through the simple, agonizing act of being unreachable. When Holt tried to close the distance and use his superior weight to smother the champion against the ropes, Ali evaporated, spinning off to the side with a grace that made Holt look like a blindfolded giant. The inertia of Holt's enormous body became his primary adversary. Every time he missed, the force he had generated pulled him off balance, forcing his muscles to work twice as hard to stabilize his frame. He was a man who had built his entire identity on the reliability of his strength, but in the presence of such absolute technical mastery, that strength was being converted into a liability, a heavy anchor dragging him down into the depths of his own fatigue. As the minutes ticked by, the illusion of Holt's dominance began to crumble with terrifying speed. The predatory confidence that had filled him just moments ago was replaced by a cold, creeping realization that his power was a currency that held no value in this specific arena. He began to gasp for air, his lungs burning from the effort of chasing a shadow that refused to cast a reflection. His movements, once calculated and dangerous, grew wide and desperate, his arms flailing in arcs that Ali predicted with a casual tilt of the head. The rage that had fueled Holt's initial charge turned into a hollow kind of despair, a paralyzing awareness that he was being toyed with by a mind that operated on a plane he could not even conceive. He looked at Ali and saw not a fighter, but a mirror reflecting his own limitations, a silent witness to the fact that his violence was a crude and ineffective tool. The champion remained a picture of serene composure, his hands still low, his breathing rhythmic and controlled, a haunting presence that existed just beyond the reach of Holt's trembling fingers, leaving the giant to drown in the vacuum of his own failed intentions. The air in the gymnasium had reached a state of feverish compression, every observer holding their breath as the inevitable conclusion approached. Holt, driven by a primal necessity to salvage his crumbling reality, gathered the remnants of his strength for one final, desperate surge. He ceased to be a technician or even a brawler, becoming instead a desperate engine of forward motion, throwing the entirety of his 100-kilogram frame into a charge that left no room for retreat or recovery. His face was a mask of strained effort, his lungs whistling as they struggled to draw in the humid Miami air, and for a fleeting second, it seemed as though the sheer volume of his aggression might finally overwhelm the champion's ethereal defense. He lunged forward with a wide, looping right hand, a blow born of exhaustion and wounded pride, intended to catch the shadow that had eluded him for so long. At that precise moment of maximum vulnerability, when Holt's weight was committed irrevocably to the vacuum of his own miss, Ali finally acted. The counterstrike was not a flourish of violence, but a masterpiece of economy and physics. It began invisibly, a surge of kinetic energy starting in the ball of Ali's lead foot as it gripped the canvas. This impulse traveled upward with the speed of an electrical current, channeled through a perfectly aligned leg and amplified by the sudden, sharp rotation of a hip that had been honed by decades of discipline. The energy surged through the core of his body, snapping across the shoulder and down the length of an arm that moved with a velocity the human eye could barely register. It was a short, crisp cross that traveled no more than several inches, yet it carried the concentrated truth of the situation. The glove connected with the exact point of Holt's chin, with a sound like a dry branch snapping in the winter woods. The impact was transformative. Holt's forward momentum did not merely stop, it was redirected by the shockwave that traveled through his nervous system, short-circuiting the very mechanisms of his balance. His eyes, which had been fixed on Ali with such predatory intent, went wide and then hollow, the lights behind them flickering and going dark in an instant. For a heartbeat, he remained suspended in the air, a titan caught in the transition between life and unconsciousness, before the laws of gravity reclaimed him. He fell with a heavy, reverberating finality, his body folding in stages like a great ancient oak that had finally been felled by a single, precise cut. The canvas groaned under the weight of his collapse, the impact sending a dull tremor through the boards that could be felt in the souls of everyone standing in the room. An absolute, heavy silence descended upon the gymnasium, more deafening than the loudest roar of a stadium crowd. The rhythmic sounds of the city outside seemed to vanish, leaving only the soft hum of the overhead fans and the labored, shallow breathing of the fallen man. Ali did not dance. He did not raise his arms in victory or shout to the rafters. He stood perfectly still over the motionless form of the giant, his hands dropping naturally to his sides. His expression was not one of triumph or even satisfaction, but a profound and weary sadness that bordered on the maternal. He looked down at the man who had tried to break him and saw only a child who had been forced to learn a lesson through pain. The physical battle had reached its conclusion, leaving behind a vacuum where Holt's ego had once resided. The champion remained a sentinel of quiet dignity, his silhouette framed against the dusty Miami light, marking the end of the combat and the beginning of a far more painful internal reconstruction for the man lying at his feet. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to hum with a new, intrusive frequency as Holt finally felt the world stop spinning. He sat on a low wooden stool in the corner of the ring, his back pressed against the cold, unyielding turnbuckle, while a trainer pressed a stained towel filled with crushed ice against the side of his jaw. The physical agony was secondary to the hollow, cavernous sensation expanding in his chest. For the first time in his life, the silence of the gym did not feel like a tribute to his power, but like a vast, empty mirror reflecting the wreckage of his own assumptions. He kept his head bowed, his eyes fixed on the dark droplets of sweat and water that pooled on the canvas between his feet, unable to meet the gaze of the men who had watched his myth vanish in a single, crisp instant. The rage that had defined his existence for decades had evaporated, leaving behind a cold, sterile vacuum that made him feel smaller than he had ever been. Ali moved into his field of vision, not with the swagger of a victor returning to his throne, but with a deliberate, grounded slowness. The champion crouched down, bringing his face level with Holt's, forcing an intimacy that the fallen man was not prepared to handle. There was no mockery in Ali's expression, no trace of the showman who entertained the cameras and the crowds. Instead, his eyes held a terrifyingly clear quality of recognition, as if he were looking at a younger, cruder version of himself. He spoke in a tone that was barely a whisper, yet it carried the weight of an ultimate verdict, bypassing Holt's ears and striking directly at his conscience. He did not talk about the punch or the mechanics of the knockdown. He spoke of the invisible architecture of the mind. He told the giant that the man he had truly been trying to destroy for the last hour was not the one standing in white trunks, but the shadow of his own fear that he had been running from since he was a boy. Every word acted as a surgical incision into Holt's psyche, peeling back the layers of scar tissue he had used to protect himself from the world. He realized that his entire life had been a frantic construction project, a massive wall of muscle, aggression, and intimidation built to keep the truth at bay. He had believed that being the most dangerous man in the room was the same as being complete. But now, sitting in the ruins of that belief, he saw that the wall had only ever served to isolate him. The champion pointed out the fatal flaw in Holt's approach, explaining that a man who fights to prove something is already defeated because he is a slave to the very people he seeks to impress. Holt felt a strange, stinging moisture in his eyes that had nothing to do with the sweat or the ice. It was the excruciating pain of a soul being forced to breathe for the first time without the suffocating weight of an ego. The transition within Holt was visible in the way his shoulders finally dropped, losing the rigid tension of a lifetime of defensive posturing. The devastation of the knockout began to transform into a grim, necessary clarity. He looked at the champion and saw not an enemy, but a custodian of a reality he had been too terrified to acknowledge. The realization that he had been playing a small, primitive game while the world moved in a grander, more complex rhythm was more crushing than any physical blow could ever be. He understood that the fortress he had built around himself had not been a sanctuary, but a prison, and the impact of Ali's fist had merely been the catalyst that caused the ceiling to cave in. In that quiet corner of the Miami gym, amidst the smell of liniment and the fading afternoon light, the man known as the Butcher ceased to exist, leaving behind a stranger who was finally ready to look at the world without the distorting lens of his own pride. He reached out a trembling hand, not to strike, but to acknowledge the bridge that had just been built across the abyss of his own misunderstanding. 6 months had passed since the afternoon the air in the Miami gym had been shattered by the sound of a single, decisive blow. The seasonal humidity had shifted, but the familiar scent of old leather and sweat remained embedded in the wooden floors, a permanent record of every struggle that had unfolded within those walls. When the heavy door creaked open this time, the atmosphere did not recoil. The man who stepped across the threshold was still a mountain of a human being, his shoulders broad enough to block the light from the street, but the quality of his presence had undergone a fundamental alteration. Jack Holt moved with a newfound lightness, his footsteps no longer echoing with the rhythmic thud of a conqueror, but with the quiet purpose of a man who had finally made peace with the ground beneath him. The aggressive tension that once radiated from his frame like heat from a furnace had cooled into a steady, focused energy. His eyes, once clouded by the red mist of an unearned pride and a deep-seated resentment, were now clear and observant, reflecting a soul that had spent the intervening months sifting through the wreckage of its own history. He walked toward the ring where the champion was finishing a session of light movement. There was no mockery in Holt's gaze as he watched the fluid, rhythmic dance of the man who had once been his greatest source of irritation. He saw the beauty in the economy of motion, the intelligence behind every slight shift of the weight, and the profound stillness that sat at the heart of the champion's activity. Ali stopped and turned as Holt approached the ropes, acknowledging the return of the giant with a slow, knowing nod that contained more respect than 1,000 cheers. There was no need for explanations or apologies. The very fact that Holt had returned to the scene of his most public humiliation was the only testimony required. He had not come to reclaim a lost reputation or to seek a second chance at a physical victory. He had come to learn the grammar of a language he had spent his entire life misinterpreting. The training that followed was a study in patience and humility. Holt climbed into the ring, leaving his shoes at the edge as a silent gesture of reverence for the space. He did not ask to spar, nor did he shadowbox with his former violent intensity. Instead, he stood before the champion and waited. Ali began to move through the most basic elements of posture and balance, demonstrating how a man's strength was not found in the rigidity of his muscles, but in the alignment of his intent. Holt followed every gesture with a devotion that bordered on the spiritual, his massive body straining to find the subtle, effortless rhythms that Ali commanded. The giant who had once believed that power was a hammer found himself discovering that true power was a river, capable of moving around obstacles that a hammer could only hope to break. He felt the awkwardness of his own size, the decades of bad habits and defensive posturing, but he did not allow the frustration to take root. Every correction from the champion was accepted like a gift, a small piece of the map that would lead him out of the darkness of his own ego. As the sun began its slow descent into the Atlantic, casting long amber shadows across the canvas, the two men continued their work in a silence that felt heavier and more significant than any conversation. The gym around them grew dark, the other fighters having long since departed for their homes, leaving only the two silhouettes moving in a synchronized, quiet harmony. Ali's movements were instructional and gentle, his presence acting as a steadying force for the man who was learning to walk for the second time in his life. Holt's focus was absolute, his mind finally quiet enough to hear the truths that had been drowned out by the noise of his own anger. In the dim light of the fading day, the scars on his torso seemed to soften, no longer marks of shame, but symbols of a transformation that was far more arduous than any combat deployment. The story reached its quiet apex not in a moment of physical triumph, but in the simple, profound realization that the most dangerous opponent Holt had ever faced was the version of himself that had walked into that gym 6 months prior. He understood now that the lights of the arena and the roar of the crowd were merely distractions from the primary theater of existence. The greatest battle a man could ever undertake was the one fought in the silence of his own heart. The struggle to discard the armor that had become a cage and to look into the mirror of his own soul without blinking. As the final light of evening vanished from the windows, leaving the two men in the deep, peaceful shadows of the ring, it became clear that the journey Holt had begun was not measured in miles or victories, but in the quiet, steady progress of a man who had finally decided to meet himself face to face. The truth, as the champion had once promised, had won, and in that victory, the giant had finally found his freedom.